We're on Daf Chafam and Beis, and we got up to parallel to Tosis Dibra Maskil Petsua Daka. Isha, the Gemara asks, Isha she'ein lo bonim lo tisyavim. Maybe a woman without children should not fall for Yibum. We should not allow Yibum. Gzeira mishum Isha sheyesh lo bonim. Because if you're going to allow a woman to marry to her brother-in-law, then maybe she'll think that you, or other people think that you're allowed to marry your brother-in-law, even if it's not b'makom yibum. The Tosfos is bothered by this kasha. It means you basically just undermine the entire mitzvah of yibum. How can you do such a thing? So Tosfos sort of reinterprets the Gemara, and he says that the kasha of the Gemara is in a case of a woman who doesn't have children for a long time or something of that. So, Ochiv Shahilo Bonamu Mesu Koda Misoso Nigzar Otu Mishieshlo Bonam Bishas Misoso. So the Gemara says, Bebonim Tali Rachmana Umeide Yodi. He says that everyone knows that the mitzvah, it's common knowledge that the mitzvah of Yibum depends upon the death of a brother without children. That's public knowledge. So no one's going to be matir marrying a brother-in-law just because they thought that there's a mitzvah of Yibum, even though the brother-in-law has children. So Gemara now asks, Eishes achiv shahayu bolamo lo tisyavim. Even if the two brothers lived at the same time, they coexisted, we should not allow Yibum, Gzeira Mishum Eishes Achiv Shelo Hayabolama. Because then, in the case of Eishes Achiv Shelo Hayabolama, they're going to go ahead and be biyabbing them, even though that would be a violation of an Easter Erva of Eishes Ach. And once again, Tosfos is saying that the Gemara's kasha is that an Isha Shelo Hayalo Banami Olam Lo mi baila zeh, v'lo me acher. That's what the Gemara meant to say, that in a case where she had been married before with a different husband, she never had children from that husband nor from this second husband, yesh ligzar atu islandess. They may come to compare or suspect her being an islandess, and how can we allow for Yibum in such a case if on two occasions she didn't have children? Maybe she's an islandess. And then people are going to be matir an islandess. So Gemara answers, "B'yeshiva toler Rachmanu made the yediyah." We need that two brothers be alive at the same time, and everybody knows about that. So therefore, we're not going to come to be matir Eishes Achiv Shlo Hayabolom. The Gemara asks, "Kolai Hanoshim Lo Tisyabna Gzeira Mishum Islandis," and the Gemara answers, "Lo Shchicha." Mamzeres unesina nami. Perhaps we should say that we cannot allow for, let's say, chalitza even in the case of a mamzeres. And the Gemara says, lo shchicha. So what the Gemara is asking now is, if you're telling me that in the case of lo shchicha, like you're not worried about an islandess case because it's not common, then in the case of Mamzeres and Nesina, we said that they're not allowed to have Yibum because it's a Gzeira Otu Mamzeres Unesina Shelo B'makom Mitzvah. But Mamzeres and Nesina is quite rare, so why do you institute a Gzeira? Elam Rava says that the Gzeira in the case of Yibum of Chayvei Lava is not because we're afraid that they'll allow for Yibum Shelo B'makom Mitzvah, but rather Gzeira of Bia Rishona Otu Bia Shnia. The heter of Yibum in the case of Mamzeres is based on Esei Dochalosis, but that only applies to the first Bia when he's Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum, but the second Bia that has no mitzvah. And in effect, he would have to divorce his wife, his Yevamot, after the first Bia. And we're afraid that he might not do so. He might have a second Bia, which he violates the law of Mamzeres. He says here in the footnote Lav dafka bia shnia el af gmar bia rishona os. Even to complete his first bia would be a problem. There's essay dochalos only on tchilas bia. Tanya nami hochi. We also have a brisa to support Rava in ba'alu the bia rishona osur lekaimon the bia shnia. Right? In the case of an isolav, even though he's kona with the first bia, and that's based on essay dochalosas, but as far as allowing that marriage to continue beyond the first bia, that we cannot do because there's no longer a mitzvah in the second bia and there's no essay to override the losas. Other amarava, b'temer of ashi, lav milsahi diam. That which we said that chayve lavin on a doraisa level, you're allowing bia rishona based on essay dochalosas. And there's only an Isur D'Rabbanan, a Gzeira and a Chash for Bia Shnia, that can't be true. Essay Dochalosa would not apply in the case of Yibum. The Omer Shlok is Kol Mokum Tatamotze, Essay Velosas, Imata Yochel Lekayim Shneim, Mutav, V'im Lav, Yavo Essay V'yitchesed. We only apply Essay Dochalosa when you have no choice. It's impossible to achieve the essay without violating the losis. But in a case where Yochel L'Kayim Et Shneim, we do not apply the principle of essay dochalosa. And therefore, in the case of Yibum, since there's an option of chalitza, there's no need and no pressing need to override the losas with the essay of Yibum when there's an option of chalitza. And Rava says, Hachanami efshar b'chalitza. Here too, in the case of Yibum b'chayve lavim, let's just encourage him to do chalitza, to mekayim essay vilosas. In other words, he has both. He's mekayim the essay instead of Yibum but with chalitza, without violating the losas. That, says Rava, is what we have to do. However, the Gemara objects to this. Meisvei v'imbalu kanu. In the Bryce, it mentions Psuadaka, Kushivcha, Sris Adam. They're all also Bebas Yisrael B'Yisrael Lav. And in Balu, in the case of Yibum, then Kanu B'Di'evet. The Kinyan is valid. Let's prove from this Brysa of Imbalu Kanu that the Iser of Yibum in these cases is only D'Rabbana. And there's no Isim in a Torah, because if there would be, then the Yibum would not be valid. How could the Kinyan be valid with the Eved unless you're talking about only an Isa D'Rabbana? And when we say that the Kinyan is valid with the Eved, it means that it patters them from Yibum and Chalitza and that Tzoras from Chalitza. How could this be so unless you apply the principle of Esei Dochalotza, which point to Reish Lakish Rava says was impossible? Tiyuvta. Therefore, this price is complete upslug of Rava. We have to prove from this price that Yibum of Chayve Lavim is only D'Rabbanan. It's Gzeira Bia Shona Atu Bia Shnia. Itmar Bias Kohen Gadol Bi'almona. Now, with regard to an almana, a woman who was married previously, the Kohen Gadol is enjoined from having a marriage relationship with her on two counts. Number one, because of a lav, and number two, because of an eser. Now, a Kohen Gadol was a yavam, and an almana fell for yibum to the Kohen Gadol, which means for the mitzvah of yibum, which is always by definition almana. And here we have machlokas from Yochanan and Rebbe Elazar, so we don't know who holds what, but Chad Omar, Eino Poteres Tzarasa. If the Kohen Gadol would have a bia with this almana in the framework of Yibum, it does not in any way impact on the tzara. Whereas Chad Omar Poteres Tzarasa. If the Yavam, the Kohen Gadol, would have this relationship with an almana, and he's kona b'di'evet, it patters up the tzara from chalitza. Because on a doraisa level, the tzara is muterisla. It's only an isa mishum gzeira, and b'di'evet, we're not going to insist that she's not allowed to get married based on an isa drabanon. And here on the top of Chaf Aleph, Gemara says, "Bi'almana min hanisuin kuliyavalo pligi lo pach." There was never a debate about could the bia of the Kohen Gadol be valid in a case of almana min hanisuin. Why? Because they ain't essay dochelos of the essay. Right, in the case of an almana l'kohen gadol, as we mentioned earlier, there's both a lav and an essay. So the essay of Yavam cannot override the lotus of the essay in the case of an almana l'kohen gadol. Hence, there's no doubt that he cannot be kona and pater her or her almana and or her almana. Kibli. So where is the territory of the machlokes Shim Rab Yochai and Rab Lazar? The almana mina erisin, which means that there's only an isur la. She's still a besula. So even though the Torah in an assay tells Kohen Gadol b'besula yikach, she still maintains her status as a besula. And Mandior Poteres, according to the Mandior who validates the bia of a Kohen Gadol with an almana min ha'erisin, the osiyas sevid nochias losas. Since now we're left with only a losas without the essay of besula yikach, therefore the essay of Hebrew will override the losas of lo yikach. Mandior, according to the other Mandior, bias Kohen Gadol eina poteres michalit. And the reason for that is lo osi essay v'dochalotza eva the efshe b'chalita, and we're employing the logic of Reish Lakish that this is efshe l'kayim without violating the lav through chalitza, and chalitza is a kiyum mitzvah. Moes meisvei, but what are you going to do with the brisa that we mentioned earlier on Daf Yutes and Beis at the bottom of the Omer about chayving lavim that imbalu kanu? We derive from there the conclusion that in Torah there is a heter yimum in the case of chayving lavim, and that's basically essay dochalosas. Now you're telling me there's no essay dochalosas because of Reish Lakish's logic of efshel l'kayim al yidei chalitza tiyuvta. The Gemara says the man Yomi that says eino poteres, and is not willing to validate the yimum in this case, is upshlogged, because you can't say other than bias kohen gadol b'almana poteres tzarasa, at least in the case of an almana min ha'eris. Lemet hevinami tuv to the Reish Lakish. So what is Reish Lakish going to do with this price? Reish Lakish ki amina na heichid v'mekayim mitzvah. I was only talking about a case where your option is an alternative method of fulfilling that same mitzvah, but chalitza is not a fulfillment of the mitzvah of yibum. Avol chalitza v'akum yibum lav mitzvah, and therefore, clearly, Reish Lakish would say in this case that essay dochalosas, because there's no alternative essay that would allow you to protect against the violation of the losas. And this leads us to Omar Rav, which is approximately 10 lines down on Chaf Aleph Omid Al.